So, John, I think we're live.
Welcome, everyone, to another webinar by the For the Love of Art. I'm John Robinette, your host. I am muting my other device. Welcome, and I want to first off wish everybody a health and safety in this moment. I know it's still a very difficult moment in time, and we've been doing these webinars now since almost a year, and so we know that everyone's situation is changing rapidly all the time, same as the topic we are discussing today, which is couriers. So I'm going to first introduce our panel, and then we'll get started with our conversation. Joining us today to discuss the topic of the realistic future of the courier, we have Eric S. Fisher, Senior Vice President of Willis Towers Watson Northeast, Mary Coughlin, Chair of the Collections Care Network with the American Institute for Conservation and Associate Professor in Museum Studies at George Washington University, Adrienne Reed, Vice President, Huntington T. Block Insurance, Kathy Richmond, Head of Collections and Applied Conservation at Historic Environment Scotland, and the co-author of the EU Courier Training Framework. Paul Williamson, the Managing Director of Constantine, UK. Sebastian Encina, Collections Manager at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology and Chair of the Collection Stewardship of the American Alliance of Museums. Antonio Arari, from the Managing Director of Arteria in Italy. David Packer, the Chair of the UK Registrar Group and also the Head of Technical Services at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Travis Miles, the Senior Exhibitions Registrar at the Tate Modern. And finally, our co-host, Jacqueline Cabrera, the host of the Registrar Hour, coming to us live from Los Angeles, California. We also do want to give a special thanks to Ana Tabuenca, who helped to found the For the Love of Art and who kindly allowed us to completely take over her her institution today. So Jackie's going to proceed now with our topic.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for that introduction. And an additional thank you to all of our panelists who are on the webinar here today. I do want to state that we did invite the Association of Art Museum Directors to participate in this webinar, but they were not at the last minute able to find anyone to participate with the program. So we did ask them if they had a written position statement, since they have been very vocal on this topic in the past couple of months. However, they did state that they did not have one. So maybe next time they can join us for this inclusive and transparent dialogue that we're going to have today. I just want to remind everyone that when we're talking about couriers, in this particular scenario, we're talking about loans that would have required a courier traditionally. So not all art shipments, but just loans that required couriers. In addition, when we're speaking about these remote couriers, we're also going to be talking about, the outgoing loan theory or policies, and then exhibition loan couriers. So in some ways, there's two tracks on the same conversation. We're going to start off talking about the need for some standardization in terminology. And John, I want to bring you back onto the dialogue to talk about the two new terms we really would like to standardize, not only within museums, but shippers, et cetera.
Sure. So before I chime in on that, I do want to remind everyone that sign into your YouTube or your Gmail account and post your comments in the live chat, and we'll definitely be addressing questions as we go. So regarding the terminology, we are favoring and leaning away from this term virtual courier, and that's for various reasons. Number one, we don't want to work virtually. First and foremost, we feel like, we can better operate using the term bookend supervision. And also we also we really want to encourage people to clarify exactly what they mean if they do use the term virtual courier. So obviously there's now a product called Virtual Courier by Articheck. The Art Institute of Chicago has a program that they call Virtual Courier. Some people refer to Virtual Courier as virtual installation. So none of this is very clear. So if we refer to our airport supervision and as bookend supervision, for example, and then we talk about whether it's a virtual install or a live web chat install. It's a much more precise conversation that we're having regarding what we're actually talking about when we refer to how we're going to monitor the safety of our objects when they travel. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, and John, we also talked about in previous chats about using the word remote installation.
Right.
Versus the virtual courier, because
Right.
basically there is a actual person who is remotely located in another location.
Right.
So just for some clarity. So I just want to state that in regards to that, there are several documents that are being updated to reflect that terminology clarity. So you'll be seeing more of that being published around and shared with everyone. So let's move on to we're going to call out Kathy Richmond, who is one of the co-authors of the European Training Framework Program. And so Kathy, we chatted a little bit about this, but can you, for those that are not familiar with the training program, talk about who was involved in this and which European countries have rolled out this framework?
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks for inviting me here to speak today. So I'm representing the Courier Training Framework, which is a tool for developing and delivering courier training in line with best practice. It's a free resource and it's published on many registrar group websites, including UK Registrars Group, and I'm sure we can put some links in the chat for people as well. I should name check my co-authors. So Wenzela Brouwer, who is the head registrar at the Rijksmuseum and chair of the Netherlands Registrars Group, and Desiree Blomberg, who is the manager of exhibitions and loans coordination at the Moderna Museum and a board member of the Nordic Registrars Group. So between the three of us and with lots of help from colleagues across our industry, we've created this framework in response to a need for consistent good practice guidelines and training. And it's really a tool for people to share. The ethos behind it is that better courier practice benefits us all, and that we should only send a courier when necessary. So when that's a clear risk that can only be mitigated by direct specialist supervision. So that's really interesting in terms of what we're talking about today. It was launched 4 years ago in 2017. It's been adopted by and rolled out across all the European registrars groups. And in 2020, we released version 2, which was a version which created a greater sustainability focus. And it was adapted for our US colleagues as well and shared via ARCs. There are several translations. So I think we've got Spanish, Polish, and German. And what we'd like to do is take the learning from the situation that we've all encountered over the past year and develop a further revision, which looks at these remote technologies and remote supervision options and provides a bit more guidance and training for people. So I'm really interested about the chat today and listening and learning from everybody. And if anybody wants to contribute to that version, please do contact me so you can get involved.
Great. And Kathy, when we spoke earlier, you also mentioned a really interesting point, and I was wondering if the future framework would address this, but especially right now in dealing with the pandemic and certain staff members being vaccinated and others not yet, you brought up the issue about personal liability, about staff safety. Do you have any additional comments on that?
Just to say that I think when we're thinking about sending a courier, the focus in the past has been very much about what the needs of the artwork are. And I think this current situation brings into focus that actually couriering is quite a strenuous process on different human beings, and it's been that way for a long time. But you add COVID in, and actually there is a liability issue, and I think all employers need to think carefully about the risks that they are exposing their staff to, and build that in as part of the risk matrix when you're making a decision about how and when to send somebody. So I think we will hopefully see a move away from a policy decision that the courier always has to be there, and for it to be based on risk analysis and pragmatism. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, and you also put a burden on the host borrowing institution when you demand that a courier be there, because you have the risk of you bringing in COVID into their institution is high at this point if you have not, if the whole team has not been vaccinated. So I was very surprised to learn over the year that there were still some institutions bringing in couriers because of the courier demand from the lender. You know, and it'd be interesting to know if anyone's going to fess up that they actually did get COVID as a result of this early courier requirement in 2020 and even early 2021. So thank you so much, Kathy. I think hopefully you'll learn some more from here on the conversation, but I think adding onto the framework is going to be a benefit for everybody, because I think we're all in agreement then another pandemic will occur in our lifetime in one way or another. So we need to be prepared and wean the lessons we learned from this scenario into the future. So talking about liability, let's just go into insurance at this point with Eric and Adrian. So tell us a little bit about how the industry has reacted to this whole pandemic situation regarding couriers not being able to be on certain conveyance or installations, but also we can't ignore the comments from the museum directors of wanting to, and I'm quoting them, eradicate couriers from our programs.
I'll jump in first. I mean, in the short term, the insurance industry is basically relying on every museum's good judgment. Of course, as Kathy was saying, human safety comes first. So no one in their right mind would want somebody to be at risk of getting ill because of a requirement. Most insurance policies are very silent on whether you need a courier or not. Again, they rely on the best judgment of the museum and to do the best job they can to ensure the safety of the work as it travels from point A to point B. But in the long term, I think a blanket statement is not going to fly. The reason that the insurance policies are so broad and they are silent is because the underwriters have educated themselves and they realize that there are protocols in place that ensure the safety of these works as they go around the world. And if those standards are relaxed, just as a bottom line measure, not taking into account the safety of the work of art, there could be rollbacks on the limits that museums enjoy, the rates that museums enjoy in terms of transit rates, and the requirements in the policy. So I think long term, if there's an insistence on an absolute moratorium on couriers, I think it could be very dangerous.
Yeah, in the past year, you know, most of underwriters have been pretty flexible with the case-by-case basis of changes in the transit arrangements for the shipments due to necessity. But what we'd really like to see is the industry taking this point in time to have some innovation and perhaps not have a blanket statement on your institution's protocol on couriering, but look at holistically what the best practice would be for the art itself, and perhaps shifting to more of an agile courier requirement that is really art focused. And like Eric said, looking at the best way of transit for the art itself.
Yeah, so encouraging best practice within the perimeters that we have now. But you know, we have heard of some U.S. institutions talking about their renewal process that's starting to begin right now for those that end June 30th. And some have mentioned that their premiums have gone up, and some of them have mentioned that their transit limits are being lowered. And we're assuming that's as a result of the fact that the underwriters are nervous about the current scenario.
We haven't seen that anything particularly. It just more might be related to the overall insurance market, which is going through what we call a hardening phase due to the catastrophic losses that have been happening over the past couple of years. And in the general property market, rates are going up by 20, 30+%. The art market usually kind of tails that. So we're seeing rate increases because of that, not specifically transit or courier related.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, I think though, I think it's interesting that museums that have had a history of claims, and not necessarily big dollar claims, but a frequency of claims, it is more difficult to place their coverage, and they are seeing a bit of contraction in the marketplace, that now carriers are paying more attention to losses. They are more risk adverse. Some are scaling back their capacity in the fine arts sector. The amount of coverage they're offering for the rate they're getting is very low in their opinion, and they're looking to get rates up. And part of that, they're seeing these giant 9-figure transit limits as lost income, lost revenue in terms of premium. So again, thinking long term, I think it's key that museums realize that what they have now is not written in stone, and it can change. The insurance industry is very reactive, and it will only take one bad loss where, if it was felt that a courier would have mitigated that bad loss, for the whole industry to change. So one institution's decision on couriers could impact the whole of the museum community. So again, I think it's a little reactive to just put a blanket, statement out that, we're going to put an end to physical couriers.
Can I ask a question? Is what you're talking about universal, or is it across, say, international, or is it particular to the United States?
I mean, it's the insurance market, is really driven by reinsurance. And so if the reinsurance market is paying a big loss, they're going to look at what we're doing, and it would be a global phenomenon. So if they're seeing that museums around the world are getting giant transit rates, and that there's very little requirements in terms of transits, if there's a bad loss, all of that can change, because everybody eventually is using the same reinsurance market to place these big risks. So again, it's, I think that museums need to think big picture. One institution could impact everybody.
But if now, how does an insurance company define a courier? Like, if you have a bookend courier situation where someone on the other side is there supervising, is that still considered a courier by your standards?
Yeah, but again, it's they're relying on the professionalism of the museum industry.
Yeah.
But if they see that, and again, I don't think anything's going to happen until something happens. Again, it's very reactionary. But if something happens, then I fear what the impact would be on everybody. So for right now, again, they've been very silent on the issue. I mean, we talk to underwriters and say, yeah, that makes sense. We don't want to put anybody in harm's way. But if something of high value is moved, and something goes sideways, and it was determined that a physical courier from that lending institution who was there, championing that work's safety wasn't present, something happens, then everything will change.
It's also important to note for museums to just be very transparent with your broker. More information is better. If you have changes, let your broker know so that they can pass that on to the insurer, because one of the worst things that could happen is a loss where insurers are surprised. If they know what the change is and what the plan is, and there's a loss, that could be understood. But if they're blindsided by it, then that could be even more of a problem for a claim.
And in the renewal process, we've also heard that some registrars have reported that the brokers are asking them, what is the position of couriers within your museum?
Absolutely. It gets to
Yeah.
that point of being transparent and open about what your plans are and what your institution's position is.
Yeah, so to the registrars out there, as you're renewing, make sure you understand the position that your museum is taking on moving forward regarding couriers. Absolute liability issues. Does this tie in any way with the couriers? I mean, we all detest that word, but that clause. But
I mean, absolute liability is a problem at any time, you know, no matter what, right? It's, you know, the only thing that I could see where it'd be a problem is if, and perhaps Eric can add to this too, is that, you know, with the US museum policies, there is no transit courier requirement. So, you know, there really wouldn't be a situation where, or hopefully not, where a claim would be rejected because of how the museum transported it. Now, if there's an international institution that has clear, specific guidelines and conditions regarding how the shipment takes place, and that doesn't happen, and then the claim is denied because of it, then that would be a problem with absolute liability.
Can I make a question, Jacqueline?
Yes, of course.
To Eric, because I want to have a clarification about what he said before, because to my knowledge, I don't see any request in the insurance clauses here in Italy about the presence of a courier, in presence or Bookend Courier. I mean, there are many requests from the insurance company, you know, to drivers, night security, satellite control, etc. But I never saw any request just to ask or to be informed if there is a courier couriering accompanying the shipment. So I wonder how the insurance is checking that, because for what Eric said, I understand that there can be much difference in risk if there is a courier or not. But for my knowledge, again, I don't see that this request comes from, at least from the Italian insurance brokers here.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a conversation between the museums and the broker. It's one of the, I mean, it's almost automatically assumed with a certain value of shipment or a certain fragility of shipment that there is going to be a courier if allowed. And on the shipper side, it's really, you know, like you were saying, they're asking about, you know, dual drivers, GPS tracking, you know, air ride, climate control vehicle. Those are the questions that the shippers would necessarily get. But again, the policies are so broad, there is no requirement that a courier be there. Oftentimes I'll get a call saying, you know, we're sending this to point B, do we have to have a courier? And it's, you know, I'll just reply, so it's really your best judgment. And that's, I think that's the driving factor, is that it's the best judgment of the institution that's charged with safeguarding that particular work of art.
I think if I recall correctly, it's the French that have a cultural patrimony clause that requires couriers. But other than that, I don't think there's any other country that really states within their insurance policies that a courier is required. It's left up to the institutions at that point. So
yeah, I could just add quickly, it's the same for the UK, but I think there's two elements. There's for the museums and commercial, but I think it's down to, with the museums and the agents in whichever country, it's down to trust and relationship. So you get to a point where, you know, a certain museum is lending something, you know their requirements, but obviously the additional requirements now. Yeah. And it's the trust. So the museum trusts the particular agent and they know what they will provide and vice versa. So it's about talking to each other and build, you know, over the years, build up trust and relationships with certain institutions. So it goes without saying, but there's no requirements either in the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Sorry, in Spain, we have the same situation as Antonio and Paul has has said. And most of the organizers normally follow what is in the loan contracts. This is what really matters in that sense.
So dictated by what the lender's best practices are.
Yes.
Adrian and Eric, have there, in the past year, I had someone pose this question to me and I said I would pass it on. Have any claims been made in regards to lack of a courier in this past 12 months?
I can speak on behalf of Huntington T. Block, and which we insure 1,000 museums across the United States, and there has not been any claims related to specifically a transit involving where there would have been a courier and there was not a courier. But that being said, there have been very, very, very few claims in our course of our history that have involved transits where there were a courier. So only time will tell. It hasn't been tested, so to speak. So it only takes that one bad claim to change things up. And that's what we hope can be avoided.
Yeah, and I had read that 85% of all claims are derived from transit loss. Is that an accurate percentage rate?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough thing because I wonder if they're talking about volume of loss, frequency of loss, or severity of loss, right? And that's a very different thing because yes, transit claims are very frequent, but that usually involves dealers shipping art through FedEx and UPS, which is very, very different than a museum sending an exhibition with across the world.
Yeah.
Versus the severity of loss issues, which typically involve something related more towards fire at the institution or water damage, that sort of thing.
Or theft, or yeah. Great. So we'll move on now. Thank you so much.
One second, Jackie. We did have someone in the chat ask about courier requirements with indemnity. So
a U.S. indemnity or the EU indemnity?
They didn't specify.
Okay, well, just to reiterate, the U.S. indemnity has always required a courier in transit, but they have extended their review of case by case until the end of this year, and that was confirmed by Pat Loico about a month or two ago. So there have been scenarios where they agree to the waiving of a courier in transit because the institution was able to provide a very solid plan for that conveyance. In regards to the EU, they have more guidelines. They don't have requirements like the US do. So those are guidelines. So I'm not quite sure if that answers that person's question.
If I could, maybe I could fill in a little from our end as well. So the UK government indemnity scheme does have fairly, I mean, it was referred to earlier, but fairly stringent conditions around the conditions of transport. So about how the vehicles should be equipped and operated and what the expectations are. When it comes to couriers generally, it is a discretionary matter that the museum, the parties to the loan agree on. However, I think one exception would be that one of the usual waivers, which is the lender's negligence, if there's a request that is waived, then indemnity would require a courier then. So there are some circumstances when they'd expect to see a courier, but generally speaking, no.
Also for war risk as well.
War risk. Okay, thank you, both of you. Okay, so I'm sure there'll be more questions coming up about insurance requirements, et cetera, and we'll get to those as they come along. But let's move on to Mary, who is representing conservator professional field in the museum industry. So welcome, Mary, to the dialogue. I hope you found the first couple of topics of interest to you. And I do want to apologize, Mary, to the conservators, because the registrars, we kept talking about inclusivity and transparency. And in talking to you, I realized we made a big faux pas that we should have reached out to the conservators early last year and started a dialogue. But I think everyone was just kind of trying to keep their heads above water with everything. And that was a major oversight. But I'm glad that we're now in dialogue with the conservators. And what was really great to see is that the conservation profession from the AIC actually put out a position statement in writing and shared among many. So I will put up the link shortly. If not, it will be provided to the attendees. But could you talk a little bit about what happened within the conservation field in the last year, and what brought about the catalyst to prepare this statement?
Sure. Thank you, Jacqueline, and everyone. So yes, the American Institute for Conservation, which does not just represent conservators, it's also conservation scientists and collection care specialists. So try to be broadly inclusive because we know it's an ecosystem of care. And I think last year, everyone just went into survival mode and had to get things done. And I think it highlighted the silos in the field, that everyone sort of huddled and did their thing. Mm-hmm. And really, we need to communicate better. And so this is, I think, a good start at that. I think some institutions did involve conservation, and I think some institutions, their registrars just acted and the conservators weren't part of the dialogue. And so to heal that rift, I think, is important.
Yeah.
In November of 2020 in the AIC News, there was an article about virtual currying. And I think for some in conservation, that sort of opened our eyes to what's happening if you weren't involved. And then it became really obvious that we needed a statement for our profession that we could present to the directors and the board and saying, hey, it can't just be stated, we're going to go fully virtual now, just like it can't be stated, everything needs a courier in person. It really does need to be a dialogue and inclusive, and all the stakeholders at the table making an informed decision case by case, right? So what does that specific object need? And that's really the push and the impetus for getting that statement out.
Great, and you made some really interesting comments in it, and you talk about how couriers do serve to mitigate potential damage. You talk about how virtual couriers do not constitute best practices, because I think that's an interesting comment from the conservators, and I'm sure we'll have a little dialogue about that from others. But what I really appreciated was you mentioned the budget process. That it needs to be examined holistically and not just the courier budget line item being removed from the exhibition budget. It's a bigger story than that, because it might be financially, monetarily a lesser cost, but it's an additional workload on the staff. And I know the conservators have been heavily brought into those remote installation appointments at 7 a.m. or at some odd hour because of a European lender, and that puts a stress on the staff. And I think that's as valuable as the removal of that courier cost on an exhibition budget overall. Can you comment a little bit about how the conservators have felt about these various appointments that have been scheduled in some of these heavy exhibitions?
Exactly, and the thought is that that's just going to ramp up more. And I think we're all sort of guilty of this in our professions, that it has to get done, so we get it done, and we're not really good about complaining or pushing back. And so you have the directors thinking, well, this is working, let's go for it. And so some of that is on us to have a clearer voice, a stronger voice. And the other part, not only the time zone challenges and getting, involved in trying to oversee virtually what's happening, but also the prep work, the increase of documentation that is needed so that somebody on the other end who doesn't know your object can safely uncrate it and install it. So that has really ramped up the workload on people. And then if you're also coming in with things that you're not familiar with, to then have to work through that documentation to do it properly is an increased workload. So I just think it needs to be looked at wholly of really what is the savings, because it may not be what everybody is assuming at times.
Yeah, thank you so much on that. And you do have a session that's going to address this topic in your upcoming conference. And people can register for that individual session. They don't have to register for the entire conference. Is that correct?
That is a good question, and I should know it, and I don't. But I do know it's May 4th, and okay. It's going to be a panel talking about this, and it is going to be registrars and conservators and talking about technology. And really, the idea, again, is to go more broadly, and that is what the Collection Care Network of AIC is trying to do, too, is to get everybody talking. So
yeah, and you do on that panel have one of the co-authors of the Courier Training Program, Vendela Bauer from the Rijksmuseum. So we look forward to watching her speak on behalf of the registrars. So that'll be interesting. So I see a movement going forward here where I think the conservators and the registrars are definitely going to have a more in-depth dialogue. And as I mentioned to you, I'm eager to have the conservators speak on my Zoom call, the registrar hour, in the upcoming months. So let's make a really concerted effort to keep that dialogue going between the two professions.
I like it.
Can I say something? I've done a very informal survey of a lot of the shippers that are involved with For the Love of Art. And there's something like, depending on your country and the year, 60% up to potentially 90% of the works that travel that are two-dimensional works that hang on a wall. In other words, fairly straightforward, and ultimately, depending on the state, if it's a painting, of course, it could be fragile, but ultimately not difficult to install, especially in a remote fashion. A lot of what we're talking about, in other words, is really the exceptions to these things. Like, in a way, especially if you have a bookend courier situation, it's really not complicated to have supervision pretty much the entire time, and then do a remote installation of a work that's incredibly uncomplicated to install. It seems like in some ways, like we should be able to accommodate that majority of the works that travel in a fairly easy way and extremely safe. Does everyone agree with that? Or, I understand the AIC position is kind of not in favor of that. But am I wrong? And did I misread the AIC position on that?
I think it really is, again, this idea, and it's annoying to say case by case, but really it's informed. Yeah. Our other concern was this, a lot of people are saying about, established partnerships or trusted institutions. Well, the fear, and something that I think we've all learned out of 2020, is that, are we now going to neglect the smaller institutions, the underfunded, the underserved communities who don't fit in sort of our elite system? And so we want to make sure that the lack of couriers don't prevent loans to those places as well.
That's a great point, Mary, that other people have brought up, that this discussion is happening at these really high level institutions. And we, are not taking into account the medium or smaller institutions that don't have a voice at the table. And we should change that in the future coming forward. But John, I think that's where we, as we go further in the webinar, we talk about the hybrid courier that really seems to be developing. But one point is, once again, as Mary said, it is a case-by-case situation, right? We know that as registrars. But for instance, the Australian registrars whom I spoke to last week pointed out that, traditionally we look at value, fragility, complicated conveyances, that is how we would assign couriers. So, they have an upcoming show with many, many lenders in the EU. So just imagine that those conveyance legs. Those are many potential stopovers in various different countries before actually arriving in Australia, and vice versa. So they still felt strongly that those particular lenders would require a courier because of the complex shipment route. So even though it might not be a super high value piece or a very fragile piece, it fell into that category of complicated conveyances. And so, yeah, unfortunately they do have that scenario because they are kind of around the world for many of us. But so they were very interested in this dialogue because they do know they need to adapt and change, but trying to figure it out being so far away from many of the institutions that they borrow from.
Could you also add to that list of, fragility and type of artwork, level of communication, methods of communication, how strong are they, and level of trust in the partners that will be involved in that particular conveyance? to that determination of whether or not, you know, what would be the best route for that particular item.
And also, you know, I think it's going to be apparent, installation instructions, handling instructions being very clear and well written for the borrowing institution if you're not going to send a courier. Even though you do a remote installation appointment, it really helps you have some of that documentation up front, whereas you would have relied for a human courier to explain the object's packing method or explain the hanging mechanism, etc. So yeah, it's a balance. What do you give up to take on somewhere else? So
can I just jump in and say about trust? I think there's something there about what is trust built on, and I think it's about quality of service and track record. And when we are talking about different institutions, small institutions can build that up. And I think it's up to us to communicate better as a network to share in our information so that, you know, if somebody has a good track record, they can demonstrate that trust, and we're not all seeking to have it demonstrated to us individually. Yeah, that's a great comment, Kathy. And once again, I think our industry and definitely the registrars, we need to reach out to the smaller institutions and make sure they're aware of the current issues at hand, and how they can mitigate and move forward with what's happening in the industry overall. But trust keeps coming up with every different talk, right? So in the end, I think that's the big takeaway as well. So we're going to move on to the shippers. We have Antonio from Arteria and Paul from Constantine. So let's talk about how technology and this whole courier scenario has impacted the shippers, the airport supervisors, the tarmac supervisors, the public bidding process, all that. We have some good talking points with you. So I'll let you start.
Shall I go? Antonio is not unmuted, so I'll go first. Okay. So I think overall the supervision, I mean, obviously when we do normal supervision or agents do normal supervisions around the world, they take pictures anyway in most cases. So for us, it's been more work coordinating in the beginning. So finding out what the institution wants about the packing, creating the specification, any enhanced security systems. If there's no courier and if there's no bookend courier, does it need additional packing, etc. And we found we've used the technology is quite basic WhatsApp. So it's just a question of creating a WhatsApp group in advance and having the talk in advance of what's happening, and then just taking pictures. Now, not all countries or air cargo terminals you can take pictures in or videos, but in the UK we managed to take some. And it's worked fine. The only thing we would say is not everyone answers. So obviously you see the ticks highlighted, but people don't answer back. So you assume it's okay. That would be one little thing we've picked up. But it's just a question, taking a picture. If it's an export, just taking a picture when it's loaded at the museum, on the truck, off, etc. Palletization. And the same, we've done a few imports this week where things have come in, and then we've had the same from our partners overseas, and then we know exactly what's going on. I mean, the service which is provided by agents is the same, just enhanced with the technology virtual thing, communication. And as Adriana said, communication is key. It's just finding out what people want or expectations in advance. If you work with an institution over the years, you know what they want, and they may add a few things, but it's understanding what they require in advance, and what they know what you want and provide to them as well. So I mean, for us, it's worked fine. It's just it's a learning curve for everyone, but it's worked well, I think.
And Paul, are you finding that institutions that would have required a courier, but are not sending one, are you finding for your actual airport supervisors, are those lenders or borrowers asking more of your airport supervisors than they normally would have?
Not lots more. I mean, as I said before, when we do if there's no courier, I mean, the thing is, when you do a supervision without the courier and with a courier, you do it the same. Most companies do. So you don't, the only things you might do differently is you're stopping to take pictures and checking to say, are you okay with this? But the service you provide is fundamentally the same. The only difference is now when you've got, say, if there's no courier traveling, you still have to give, and there's no Bookend Courier, but one's needed, you might need 2 people in the cargo shed, because if you've got one small case, you're looking through your camera, your phone, and you can't really see peripheral what's going on. So the only other thing there is you need an additional person if you've got more than one case, so you can check. So one person is just filming or taking pictures while you're seeing what's going on and reporting back to the institutions. So I think overall, I think it's just more time up front to find out what's required, and just working closely with and it's communication. I mean, we did something in a different country for an institution in LA, and we had to de-install. So we had to act as a registrar and a conservator, and it was massive time differences, and it worked fine. It's just communication, and trust. I'm going to use that word again. Sorry, trust.
Yeah, I think that's the word of the year. So Antonio, let's hear a little bit from you regarding this issue.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Yeah, I mean, I think that we are facing a very difficult moment, and different ways, to offer our services. And at a certain point, we felt that it was needed to do something more. I mean, as Paul is saying, the service that we provide is the same, but the possibility to offer to our clients a kind of monitoring, a kind of way of monitoring the shipment from remote. I want just to give you a few numbers. Right these days, we are handling a very large exhibition in Italy, with many loans coming from all over. There are 240 loans, 120 lenders from all over the world. And in a situation like this, we should have 50, 60 couriers or more. We had 6 couriers only, 5 from Italy and 1 from France, and no one else. UK lenders at the moment are really having this position not to send the couriers, but they are asking for remote monitoring of the installation, mainly unpacking and installation. So we are providing all of that. At the same time, as you know, we decided to help develop this system to monitor all the different transit checks of an exhibition, which is called Westworld Courier. John was telling at the beginning with ArtiCheck, because this gives not only the monitoring of the final phase, but the whole phase during the transport. It's something new, something that we didn't have before. And as you ask, sure, this is giving more responsibility to our staff when it's needed, more work to our supervisor at the airport. They still have to do the same like they've done it before, but they have to add all this kind of assistance and monitoring. It is something that can be useful, but I think that the case by case scenario, which is what we said before, is really the key decision about the couriers, because probably before the pandemic, we had not all the shipment, but many shipments going with couriers. So there was always couriers. Now we have different possibilities, to decide and to choose. But this decision must be taken on a case by case, because it depends on trust, again, with the institution organizing the exhibition, trust with the agent, but also the fragility of the artwork. So it's very difficult to take, a final decision. And I think as a shipper, we need just to give different possibilities, so we can, and we hope to have courier back again, because as I said, I mean, in all these 20 years that we had for me, much more. I mean, for my new company, it's 20 years. We had many couriers coming, and it was very important. We were saying the other day, it was very, very important, because I think that the role of the courier, on top of what they have done to protect the artworks, was to share procedures, best practice. And I think that if now in many countries, we have the same standards, high standards in handling artworks, this was also due to the presence of the couriers, because they have been sharing, from US, from Italy, I mean, all of them sharing all these best practice, and it's learning for all of us. So this was very important. But probably now we have technology that in many cases, also to help the budget, can be avoided when it's a simple painting, or there is trust with the exhibition organizer. So, I mean, I think having all the possibility open is very, very helpful.
Yes, and Antonio, you had mentioned the strength or the potential of networking with the couriers and everyone getting to know each other. I know for registrars, it's so important for us to meet our shipping agents in person and develop that relationship as well. Before I go on to John and some potential questions from the chat, I just want to state that we're probably going to run over about 10-15 minutes. So if people want to know how long the webinar is going to be, we still have 3 really good speakers that we need to address, and then some Q&A. So John, you mentioned there was some dialogue in the chat in follow-up to what Paul Antonio had to say.
Yeah, so questions regarding taking photos in the cargo areas. So one question was, are photos actually permitted? And the second question was, what about taking photos in areas where you, and sharing photos that you, in areas that you wouldn't normally get to see? Can you comment on that?
Normally they are not permitted. It's a fact that most of the time we can do it. We have to avoid to take some sensitive areas. But if we need to make the picture of a crate, of a pallet done, the number of the pallet, this is 90% of the time is possible.
Yeah, the same in the UK anyway. On the tarmac, which is you normally have to get, I hope no one sees this from the BAA. Anyway, from the tarmac, allegedly, a friend told me, and inside the warehouse as well you can. But it's down to the people you're taking. And the handlers in the warehouse realise that when we haven't got a courier, they're used to seeing couriers sometimes, that we have to do it. So we say to them, stop, can you wait a minute? I need to take a quick picture. As long as we're not taking 150 pictures, they're okay just to take a quick snap. But also sensitive, going back to your question, the sensitive areas, obviously if we've got cases travelling and there might be a picture in a person's warehouse, then we'd have to be careful. We don't want to take anything else, other people's works or things in the picture. So we're mindful that we only take that institution's work. So we're careful not to include too many other things in it, which are sensitive areas as well. So we have to be careful.
Because I think it's important for those non-experienced registrars to understand that your company has built up relationships with the cargo personnel at the various ports, and inappropriate requests from a museum could damage that relationship that you have and make it hard for the rest of the museum industry to once again ask or request a photo of a certain area.
Yeah.
John, any other questions in the chat regarding that?
No more questions. We did have a couple other interesting comments, however. Travel insurance for couriers is getting more complicated. Some lenders are insisting on sending couriers. They ask for coverage for contingencies related to COVID-19. And then also someone pointed out that transit is just one aspect of couriering. Knowledge and care of the objects is also a huge part of why people make the decision to send one. And then lastly, if institutions are planning to vastly diminish couriers, I hope they are going to make allowances for their staff to pursue additional professional development. So that's what's going on.
I have a quick question for Paul and Antonio. With the shippers being responsible for taking more pictures while supervising, have you found, or do you think that this will take away from their ability to pay attention for the unexpected situation, like a forklift or whatnot coming?
I mean, yeah, you're right. That's why I said it. If it's say one case, then you can probably do it. But if you've got any more than one, then we have another supervisor. If there's no bookend courier presence, bookend supervision. So if we are entrusted to do everything, they would have a second person just for filming and allegedly filming and recording. Same as the museum would, the other side. So I guess in the institution is borrowing the work, that they would have a separate team or persons doing the filming and recording, because you can't, because you've got faultless coming left and right. You've got your peripheral vision. You're looking for, I mean, I'm not the best camera person, but you're looking through the phone and you don't see what's going on around you. So the answer is you have to have another person just to be full attention.
Yeah. On the other hand, Paul, there is a lot of time where you can, waiting time where you can take pictures.
Well, it depends how big the shipment is. If you've got like 30 or 40 crates, if you've got one case, then you've got time. But if you've got lots of things coming in, then you have to be...
At the same time, I can also say that the presence of the courier sometimes is also taking the attention of our supervisor much more than needed sometimes.
Yeah, Antonio, and that's probably, we talked about this when there's less experienced museum couriers who have not been properly trained and are stressed out in the cargo terminal and are anxious. So that's part of Kathy's job, is to make sure that couriers understand their role in the cargo terminal. But going back to Adrian's comment, other shipping agents have mentioned about if a museum is requesting too much of that oversight on their behalf, when a shipment would have required a courier, of adding an additional supervisor, but note that that's an additional cost that's being added on to the scenario. But they can all accommodate that request as well. And I have heard of some shippers who have just said to the museum, no, what you're asking for is unreasonable and not feasible. We cannot do our job properly with what you're asking. So I have heard that from some shipper, one or two. I want to move along and ask about, before we go on to Sebastian, David, and Travis, about, I want to highlight some comments that Antonio made that I thought were wonderful. When we spoke earlier, you said that the couriers have allowed the shippers to grow in quality and to have couriers present, as you said, allowed for relationships to be built up between the shipping agents and the couriers and the overall networking. But I wanted to ask both of you about this thought of potential vaccination passports that might be implemented in the future. And also, one of you made a comment, or one of the other shippers made a comment of how they're seeing a rise in upcoming courier estimate requests for the fall and 2020, which was interesting because it's dictating where the market is going. So any comments on those issues?
On the last one, I start on the last one for the budget. Yeah, this is a big issue because you don't know. I mean, no one knows at the moment to make a budget on couriers because you don't know how many couriers will come or who will decide to send the couriers. So if this is what you were asking, until now, we can only budget the courier's cost based on, afterwards, on what really is done, because at the moment there is no other way, no way to know the air tickets cost, if there will be flights or not, if the museum will send the couriers or not. So, I mean, at the moment, we can just work on that in real time and see exactly what is happening, and not possible to make budgets on that for the couriers. For the shipment, yes. Shipment cost, yes, this is not a problem, even if the air freight still is not so sure what is happening with the air freight. It's still changing a lot, but I mean, all the other costs are the same.
I think also we've been, from a few institutions in the UK, being asked about in their tenders about virtual couriers, what the agents can provide as a service to them. So that's changing the sort of language in the bidding process. So we have to give more information, which is fine, with more information about what we can provide. And I think is understanding, like you said about Australia, for example. Well, if you go into Australia, some of the places where you transfer, like Singapore and other countries, the courier can't see anything anyway.
Correct.
Because they're not allowed. So it's understanding, is speaking to your agent, whichever country you're in, and saying, I'm lending to here, what's the best way? Who's the best, what agents would you recommend us to use? And that's understanding. So you're taking on not the responsibility, but advising that, okay, if you go to this country, we've had good experience with these agents. If the actual museums have not worked in that country before, for example, and then you're advising over many years of, I had hair when I started, so it's been a few years. You can say, I would use this route because of this, and it's using your local agents, their expertise, to guide the museums through the if you're not sending the courier, what's the best way, who's the best people to do it, etc. And they might give a better route. It's more favourable than the other. Vaccination passports, I mean, no one knows, do they? I mean, it's going to be dependent on the airlines. I mean, some airlines already said that they're only going to, like Qantas and people like that, only take vaccinated people. I mean, it's depending. IATA have got, I think it's with Qatar Airlines, they're starting it off. They have a thing where you have to say you've been vaccinated, but who knows, basically, is the answer to that. I don't think anyone can foresee that.
So everyone should be careful about saving their vaccination cards at this point. Thank you so much. We're gonna, we have a very interesting question from Kathy Richmond, but first we're going to have Sebastian talk about the Collection Stewardship Network and sort of their position right now on couriers and documentation that organization is working on. So Sebastian, the table is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's good to see everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I'm representing the Collection Stewardship Professional Network of AAM on this call rather than my personal at-home job kind of. So the nice thing about going last on a talk like this, I can just say, hey, everything that everyone has said is perfect. And so please listen to them and help them guide your decisions on couriering and the choices that you make going forward. Over the past year, it has been kind of crazy. A lot of museums, particularly in the United States and across the world, have been dealing with things such as how to take care of collections when you're not even in the museum. So the position of collection stewardship has been, for the past year, but also over our history, is how do we create tools? How do we create guidelines, policies in order to assist museums, but also the collections managers and registrars in those positions themselves. As an organization, the Collection Stewardship, I'm there as a volunteer status. We don't have the power to demand anything. We don't have the power to censure or punish anybody. All we can do is provide the tools, best practices. None of this is you must do it this way or else no one's ever going to work with you again. One of the words that keeps coming up, and thank you very much, I think Kathy said it, is the word trust. When it comes to filling out a general facility report that you will probably need for a lot of these kind of contracts, that is based on trust. It's trust between the lending institution and the borrowing institution. Collection stewardship's position is to create those kind of tools. So I'm sure people are familiar with the new museum registrations method. There is a section on there on couriering, but the demands over the last year have really necessitated further interest in updating courier policies. The Registrars Committee, what Collection Stewardship used to be called, had a document called Code of Practices for Couriers and Couriering, which was originally created in 1989. I did ask several colleagues, including Jacqueline, to update that. So that is something that will be coming out. The form itself, created by Mary Busick, Alicia Thomas, Judith Klein, Andrea Coe, Evan Powell-Bowles, Amanda Venezia, Susan Sengoch, and Jacqueline, is pretty much a best practices guideline on for the people who are starting out, people who do not have a lot of experience, but even the people who have a ton of experience, as a refresher on what is it that people need and museums need in terms of couriering, breaking it down to what should a courier bring with them. So Jacqueline, you're talking about training of couriers and how important that is, the kind of documentation that they need to bring with them. But the new document is also going to go into how to deal with such strange times as COVID. As you mentioned, this may not be the only pandemic that we all have to deal with, but beyond pandemics, someone mentioned perhaps war or natural disasters, how to deal with unusual circumstances. So in effect, the position of collection stewardship is just how do we best help our members? How do we best help the museums by creating the tools, by putting out the policies, listening to our members and our colleagues, many of who you see on the screen here. Ultimately, what the Code of Practice for Couriers does say is any loan is an agreement between the lender and the borrower. A borrower or lender can come to me and say, hey, I'm in this situation, what do you think of it? And I can give my opinion, but ultimately, if you and your lender agree to something, whether there's a courier or no courier, I think that's, there's no position on my part as chair of collection stewardship to say, you're doing it right, you're doing it wrong. I can give my opinion, but ultimately it is that agreement between the two organizations.
Great. I think it's a wonderful document, and I'll be very resourceful to the membership and others. So I think you're planning to publish this sometime in May or June of this year.
Yes.
And I hope that we're, I know it's published for the membership, but I hope we can share it with the EU group and the conservators. I think, you know, and being inclusive and transparent, everyone sharing their documentation is so key at this moment. So thank you so much, Sebastian, for
thank you very much
us on that. We're going to move on to David Packer, who is the chair of the UK Registrars Group. And we had a really good conversation on Saturday morning about some bullet points, David, that we wanted you to cover and talk about. So why don't you talk to us about the approach that the UK registrars did last summer with their guideline notes?
Certainly can. Thank you very much, everybody. So obviously last summer we were facing a situation, and the UKRG at that point decided to try to put together some guidelines, at least a basic resource to be made available to registrars who are facing, who are already being approached and asked about supervising deinstallations remotely. Deinstallations for the most part, and I do say that in particular because it is relevant at that particular point. A lot of the things that were situations being faced related to the recovery of objects, i.e. quite a few things that had actually been out, and when they were installed, they were there with a physical courier, which I think helped quite a lot of people in gaining some trust or a little bit more confidence in approaching the idea of a remote supervision to bring the thing back. Anyway, but there wasn't really very much out there at the time. That people were starting to face this situation and were starting to ask questions and directing those to the UKRG as well. Does anybody have any experience of this? So we fairly rapidly put together the document. In fact, we've got a lot of input from Travis also, because he had covered some of these issues. The British Library had covered some of these issues already right at the very start of the lockdown. Halfway through this process, we became aware that Jacqueline, in fact, was also coordinating a set of guidelines for the registrars in North America. And so we collaborated basically in having a document that was consistent with the North American version as well, but also reflected some of the more local conditions here in Europe.
Correct.
And so the idea was to get those out there as soon as was possible so that they would be of use to people. And in some aspects, I think we were probably speculating a little bit about what we might encounter. I would say it's held up reasonably well. Some elements more than others. I mean, we were keen at the outset, Jacqueline, you were keen as well to make sure that the definitions were clear about bookend couriers and virtual couriers and what these two different terms might mean in relation to one another and what we were talking about. I would say that certain elements such as the importance of having a go-between or a camera person basically who could be the point of contact for the supervising contact at the lending institution to communicate with the technical team, to communicate with the conservator, because that is a role in itself. and it's too difficult for one of those team members to do and exercise proper care onto the installation or unpacking. I think at that point it was a little bit less clear as to what was going to happen with some of the supervisions through cargo warehouses and so on, and that was something that was a position that emerged a little bit later in the summer probably, and settled down to the kind of things that we've seen since then. And I suppose to finish up, we were probably a tiny bit coy about how things might develop in the future as well. I think we suspected that we could see a place for this going ahead in continuing to be a feature, and I suppose immediately we could see the advantages in the budget line, but we could also immediately see the disadvantages in general awareness in the gallery space and what else is going on around you, that actually for a physical courier is very important, I think, in getting an idea of how the installation is proceeding, what they can ask, what they shouldn't ask, and so on. So, and as well as the actual limitations of the in-depth examination of an object. Other learning points, I think, were to highlight the need for enhancing the quality of the documentation, both in terms of packing notes and in terms of condition reports, into a usable digital format, and having those with the partner institution in advance as well to work through, and some of the test runs that were required. I think we also anticipated that it was going to be time consuming on the day, and that there would have to be a fallback option if the Wi-Fi drops out or whatever, which obviously we've observed in practice quite a lot.
Yeah, well, David, I think you touched upon many of the issues that Mary talked about, Kathy talked about, and we've addressed it, and Sebastian. So with any documentation, it's always good to go back and see what can be updated and revised with the current situation 1 year later. And I guess we should do that in tandem with my documentation to make sure we're both on the same page. But I do know that it was referred by many people. So it was a great resource to not only the UK Registrar's membership, but it was posted on the Registrar's Hour website. So we were able to get it out to many more non-EU registrars out there. So thank you.
I was just going to say, I suppose the next stage is that we'll be meeting together with more of the European registrars, and again, Vendela will be in on this one to have a look at this document, as well as to because of the developments I think that you're referring to. So some of the positions that have been adopted in terms of virtual only and what that means, and I suppose actually to flesh out a little bit more about where this document sits, where this practice sits in the grand scheme of all of the tools we have at our disposal for risk mitigation. And I think here's an opportunity, as Kathy said earlier on, to actually dial this discussion back to looking closely again at the specific risks that we're seeking to mitigate with the presence or otherwise of a courier or any other kind of measures. So in fact, we do arrive at what is a new best practice, I suppose, in this sort of post-pandemic, which, well, we're not post-pandemic yet. Yeah. And bearing in mind the situation is still quite volatile as well, so it still have a kind of immediate relevance, but actually to be looking a bit further down the road as to where this actually fits into our practices.
Correct, because our opening timelines keeps shifting for so many different countries, so it's sort of a moving target. But that's a good segue now into our last speaker on the panel, and then we'll address some other key points that have been brought up. Travis Miles from the Tate. I guess in some ways you kind of represent a counter opinion because the Tate has, but the uniqueness is that the Tate has been doing this for quite some time. So I'm going to let you start off the commentary as you wish, Travis, in regarding this, and maybe you could just give a really quick synopsis of for those who are not familiar with the Tate's policy.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks everyone. And as you said, David provided a perfect seg, because I think that's what we're trying to do, is start a conversation. And speaking from an institution that has made something of a declarative statement on the position of virtual couriering, I'm conscious that we're trying not to be perceived as being too prescriptive and telling others what to do. Instead, I think the intention of making the statement was to start conversations exactly what we've been discussing today, which is to take a more holistic look at what best practice means, what exhibition making is, and to pair that with closer evidence-based examination of risk management and risk mitigation, and what we can use these new technologies to help us with, and how that will then also go on to help us with our programs and our budgets. I think the scale and type of programs that we do at Tate Modern are, I think, both typical in the sense of a larger museum, but also unique in the sense of being quite large scale international programs. And we hope that that's a bit of a kind of like workshop model that will allow us to go through some of these painful processes, so that we can share that information, begin dialogues with partners. And that was part of the intention of making a statement. Our policy is, we're calling it virtual first, with the kind of idea that we want to kind of have the presumption that we'll start a dialogue with trying to pick apart the need for a courier. And I think it's interesting that we started this call by stating this was about loans that we determine a courier is necessary for. And I think that there's some other reasons behind what those requirements can be for museums that are not always led by conservation, that are not always led by risk mitigation in transit. There's other cultural reasons for the assignment of couriers sometimes. So I think it's to kind of begin a dialogue where we can really presume that that can be something that we really need to not take for granted anymore in our conversations with borrowers and with lenders. So virtual first is the idea that we think that technological means and increased trust and correspondence with our partners can really manage the process adequately, and that there's a way in which we can reach consensus on the evolution of a best practice to include these methods, so that it doesn't need to be exclusive one from the other. And with that, just proceeding towards a reduction, basically, not necessarily a removal of all of us who work in the profession. Obviously, we know that there are quite often reasons why a courier is needed in particular instances, and it's more working towards an achievable, responsible reduction. From our perspective, responsible in the sense that it's really important for us to do in terms of, as a public institution, in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, reducing our public spend, being more flexible, and continuing to achieve the scale of programs that we need in a post-pandemic financial situation. And with that also responsible, meaning that we take on these dialogues very specifically and responsibly with our partners, taking their requirements into account. So
just for clarification, the Tate policy is about you not sending couriers with your permanent collection loans, or are you also trying to discourage lenders from sending couriers?
Well, I think that's on the first question. Yes, we do currently also basically presume that we will not be sending a courier whenever possible with our own loans from the collection. I can't speak as specifically to that as my colleagues from collections could. On the second point, I think what we're trying to do is move away from the idea that beginning this dialogue is a discouragement of any kind, and more towards the idea that it's a very important conversation to be having at this time, in terms of finance and in terms of the environment, and hopefully taking some sort of position on that will enable us to have those conversations more quickly and to be more transparent about that.
And the institution overall has found this to be a successful approach.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I think we want to be kind of very clear about is that this seems it's very early, and if we really are going to be evidence-based We have the scale of a program where we have had some experience now, and we can begin to compile some data, compile some numbers, but we really need to engage with everyone, people on this call, with the transport agents, with conservators, insurers, and professional networks, to really kind of start to get that information to see what's working, and what could be possible. And it may, I think, result in some formations of new relationships and means of talking, which would be really productive. You know, we don't always, as the insurers have said, we don't always have the kind of conversations with them that could be the most productive about, here's what we're doing. If the underwriters, for example, are being led to some extent by what is professionally considered best practice, then the sort of work that Kathy is doing, that David is doing, it could be really, really vital in terms of demonstrating that ways of folding in new technological practice could be really useful in risk mitigation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is why John and I wanted to organize this webinar, is because, as we mentioned, there are so many different conversations happening at the same time with different organizations. And we hope this serves as a catalyst for future dialogue with many different organizations, and maybe even a follow-up webinar in the fall to see where we're all at this point. So thank you very much for those comments. John, are there any pending questions in the chat right now that we should address?
No real questions. There have been some comments that people have relied on colleagues near shipping hubs to be Bookend couriers, but at some point it will be an extra burden, both time and money, again, an added expense. So, you know, it's affecting everyone, it seems like. I think that we should also point out that there's several other conversations that we're not having that are related to this, and Travis sort of addressed it, the sustainability discussion. The carbon footprint of actually sending a courier is extreme and real. And then also, we aren't talking about, this sort of courier solution that we're discussing is really trying to address a problem without changing the actual origin of the problem. We're trying to address our loan situation. We haven't talked about changing our loan situation, is my point. We are just trying to resolve our current loan practices with a new solution. And so the other thing that we should consider doing, for all of the reasons that we've been discussing, is how we loan, and maybe a different lending criteria. Maybe we don't just ship an entire exhibition from London to Sydney, Australia. Maybe we make sure that there's several stops along the way, so that it doesn't have to require such extreme courier requirements, for example. I mean, there's another discussion to be had there as well. So it's we recognize that this is a limited conversation at the moment. We do have a couple other comments that just came in while I was buying everybody time to type in their question. So I also wanted to mention that courier trips provide important opportunities to see firsthand the risks and issues, important for all staff who are involved in loans, decisions, and risk mitigation. So, and then another question directed at Travis, is there a professional group that discusses greener practices for museums? And I'll let you answer that. I know of a bunch as well.
There are organizations that I'm aware of. We do have a green committee at Tate itself, who will liaise more. I'm not personally part of that organization, but members of my team are. But I believe that there is a sustainable museums committee as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's also Julie's Bicycle. There's also Gallery Climate Coalition. There's also Galleries Unite, which is in the Galleries Unite
in the UK.
In the US. Yeah.
And AAM does have a professional network on environment and climate network. So they're very involved in greening museums as well.
Yeah, I think
And
that
AIC has a sustainability committee.
Also, yeah. Oh, yeah, and it's mentioned in your paper. So I think that'll be an interesting dialogue in the upcoming months that we can organize, and hopefully get these groups together to talk and share what information they have. So we're going to move on. Thank you, Travis, for your comments. It's good to hear from an organization that has implemented this into their program, and it'll be interesting to see down the road what lessons have been learned from this new scenario. We're going to move on. Kathy, do you want to go ahead and add in your comment or question? That was a good one.
So what I was really interested in hearing everybody talk just then is something that we touched on in the preliminary conversation, was how are we going to change and adapt and innovate to develop couriers? So this situation, it's kind of speaking to what John was talking about there. We're seeing it as temporary, and it's not. It's going to become part of life. And the opportunities to travel with things are certainly going to diminish. So how does that impact on training? And, you know, what can we do with the framework to try and help that? And it's partly about skills, because if there are less trips, there's less opportunities to experience and scale up in a graded way. And it's partly about those networks that you build. And I don't think there's any way, certainly my view on it is you can't charge another institution to send a courier just to network. It's got to be based in pragmatic risk mitigation. So how can we innovate to create those ways of learning in those situations? And I'm thinking especially for the younger generation who are entering into this career. I've got the benefit of the knowledge of how it was before and all the networks I've built up. But what are we going to do for the younger people who need to gain that somehow?
I think that's an excellent question that I think not only the UK registrars group should think about, Sebastian and the collection stewardship group and the AIC, but you know, I think technology that we're using now is going to be part of that training practice in the future. So that's a good question I want everyone to ponder on. And Kathy, anyone who wants to make a comment at the moment, please do.
I will dive in if I may.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. I mean, I refer back. I'm sure this anecdote has come up before, but I refer back to a careers talk I did about life as a registrar, and the only questions that came back to me from the assembled school party was about travelling. So it's a good point, and it does matter. And I think it's right to acknowledge that actually, while the specification of a courier should revolve around the risk to the objects of risk inherent in the trip itself, that actually there are always, I mean, everybody recognizes that there are other advantages and there are other benefits from that kind of direct two-way relationship that happens and those professional networks that are built. So yeah, I think it is a really good point, and I think you're right. We will have to address this quite carefully, I think.
I'm not a fan of the wait and see kind of response, but if we're all discussing that couriering is going to change, it's really difficult to start training people in a way that's not going to exist anymore. Yeah. So we can somehow come up with a template of, this is the way we couriered in my day, but if that's no longer relevant, I'm not sure how we can prepare for that in the future. I think having these guidelines, having the documentation, relying on the insurance brokers, relying on the shippers, because they're not going to be going away whatsoever. And then forming that as this changes, that we look at this again in the fall, in another year, in another 10 years, and then we adapt at that time. But at this point, I think it is changing, but we don't know what it will change to on a permanent basis. So we can only train in what we know right now.
Yeah, and I think if anything, we've learned how there's so many topics that have come out of this webinar that can be a webinar on their own. So I know I've taken a lot of notes and John's taken notes, but Antonio, did you have a comment?
Oh, just a quick suggestion, because the question from Katie, it's really important. I think workshops in Europe, especially, we miss a lot of workshops. International also. I know that is also a problem of budget, but see what Packing is doing in the US, what is doing Mountain Makers, what is doing ARCS. We do not have that in Europe to train people and to train registrar to make networking. So probably we should try to have some budget also for that kind of activity here in Europe.
Right.
I mean, to Antonio's point and to what David and Kathy were saying, I think we should also acknowledge how remarkably unstandardized our courier practices have been to date, right? Because there wasn't we had expectations because people did courier and people did do some traveling and they made, comparable requests. But it's not like everybody was receiving the same training, and each institution did their own training. And sometimes, and this was pointed out in the chat, how many institutions are sending curators as couriers, right? It's not like they're sitting on the tarmac for 8 hours. And so the point is, now is actually a great time to standardize our practices, and that is going to bring back to the point about trust. Is if everyone's doing the UK courier framework, for example, that is at least one measure of standardization of these practices that we can begin to depend on, and then whatever institution specific requirements you have on top of that. But in a way, we have an opportunity to have almost better care if we have these opportunities to create more wide-reaching standards. So
yeah, John, and I would say the thing about the training framework is it started as a European initiative, but it has the potential to be global, and in fact ARCs have rolled it out. Was the last opportunity I had to travel was to Texas last year as the borders were closing around me, which was great. But there's no reason why we can't all feed in to make this what we need it to be, and then it's about everybody putting their shoulder to the wheel and saying this is the standard that we want. It's like a grassroots movement, and then it can be adopted. And it's really worked in Europe, so I would hope that it can work elsewhere as well, but it does need good collaboration.
Well, Kathy, that's why when we had this initial dialogue in 2017, I wanted to see this framework rolled out around the world. And that's why I really pushed it for ARCs to present. And, I want to see it in Latin America. I wanted to see it in Australia, So I think the potential is there. And so this is a good segue to kind of wrap up the webinar. We've had a solid conversation, and I know for a fact we could have talked more to each of the panelists about their contributions. So we're going to invite you all back, hopefully in the fall, for a follow-up on this. So John, I'm going to let you wrap it up and talk about our various conversations and maybe some conclusions and next steps.
So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we've generated a lot of resources and links, and we tried to post them in the comments in the chat, but we'll also try and get them on for theloveofart.info. We'll get them up on the website and hopefully also in the YouTube description. So links to the various statements like AIC's statement, the UK Registrar's Bookend Courier statement, as well as Jacqueline's that she wrote, also the UK Registrar's Courier framework, which was developed in with the Nordic registrar group as well as the Dutch group. So we're going to get you links to all of these things, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for the YouTube channel so that you can get updates on our upcoming webinars. Usually we put one out about every other month. So that's what we have now, and continue to look for updates on articles. There's almost a new article every day, and if not several a week, on fortheloveofart.info, often about travel restrictions and flights that are available or becoming available as well. So we appreciate everybody tuning in, and we also appreciate immensely the expertise of the panel that they decide to share with us today. Any other following conclusion comments, Jackie?
Just want to say we had over 200 live attendees. This is recorded, so it will be on the For the Love of Art website link. And usually we get twice as many people following up who were not able to watch live. I know the Australians were eager to see when the recording was going to be posted. So there's many other people around the world, institutions that were not able to link on live. So I think we had a great attendance. And once again, a big thank you to For the Love of Art group. But I also just want to throw it out there. Any last comments from our panelists? Anything they want to add on to this recording? Okay, so we will see you all next time. And once again, a big thank you to John, to Anna, and to all the panelists. So everyone have a good summer when we'll readdress this topic.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.